Welcome back. It is our privilege, our honor to have Dr. Se Kim back with us. She is incredibly gracious and generous, and we are so thankful that she has actually agreed to be a part of this again tonight. That's asking a lot, but she is so willing, and we are so thankful. So as a way to get started tonight, I want to remind you that the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen is the way for you to participate in a conversation, a dialogue with Dr. Kim and me. So I want to invite you to take the time to put forth your questions. Nobody will see your questions except for Dr. Kim and I. And that's purposeful because we want people to feel the freedom to ask any question that would in any way be helpful as you journey through this dialogue between science and religion. So your questions come to us, but they don't go to anybody else. And if we have a lot of questions that we don't get to, I apologize in advance because I'll be the one to pick through those or select those in order to provide those for Dr. Kim. So thank you again for being a part of this evening. I want to begin with a word of prayer, if I may. Would you pray with me, please? Gracious and loving God, we thank you and we praise you that you are the creator of all that is. Thank you for creating Dr. Kim. We give thanks for the gift of her life. We give thanks for the gift of her love for you and for your universe. We give thanks for the work of her hands, and we pray that you will continue to bless her abundantly, that she will continue to be one through whom you speak the word of life and the word of mystery and the word of awe and wonder. So we invite you to be present in our conversation this evening, for we entrust it to you in the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. So again, Dr. Kim, thank you. What a blessing to have you be a part of this. I want to begin with giving you some feedback, if I may, as we welcome some of the questions, and I'll be doing some presentation, if you will, on the book of Genesis shortly. But Dr. Kim, many people said to me that they were so appreciative of how you purposefully created space for people to have their own thinking, for people to be able to wrestle with their own issues and questions about science and religion. And I'm curious, does that come naturally for you, or what led you to present in such a way that you're not rigid? You're not, this is the way it is, and if you don't agree with me, then you're wrong. How did you come to a place where you create the safe place to ask the hard questions?
Well, thank you for letting me join again today, and thank you for your gracious feedback. I don't know if it's natural or if it's just a defect or a default, but I know that at the end of the day, it's for everyone. It's a individual journey with Christ, right? And in that individual journey, you ask, you know, what you should think about, and as you build that relationship with God. And so it's part of my journey. I think it's a default of being a part of my journey that I am still discovering, and I want others to recognize that I'm still unsettled in a lot of these issues. And at the same time, I know from my own journey that when people are dogmatic, I mean, there's certainly things that need to be theologically, very firm, but in the spaces where, as they say, there's freedom in these kind of discussions, in the non-essentials, as Paul tells us, right? In these kind of discussions, I find it helpful to be more open than dogmatic. So,
well, it works. And many people commented on how grateful they are for your approach. So thank you. You remind me of an expression that has been used in church history, that in essentials, there must be unity. In non-essentials, there must be liberty or freedom.
Right.
In all things, there must be charity. So even with people with whom we disagree or have different perspectives, As followers of Jesus, it's really important that we model that. And so thank you for doing that, Dr. Kim. You do it so well.
Thank you.
So I got a lot of email this week about AI, artificial intelligence, and genetic engineering. People have been very curious about what you and I were talking about. And I think, Dr. Kim, it might be helpful if you could share a little bit more. As a geneticist, how do we bring ethics and morality to the conversation around genetic engineering? So, as I said last week, we don't want to create another Holocaust.
Mhm.
And there are people that think that if we're not careful, we could create a kind of system, if you will, where people are actually placing orders on skin color and intelligence and the color of one's eyes, etc. So, can you respond to that, please, in terms of how
Yeah.
do we bring the guardrails around this?
Well, I think it dives into the question of, again, what makes us human in our sense of morality. How do we make the judgment call when we have these tools and skill sets to utilize to better ourselves, right? We know that things like genetic engineering or AI, they can be placed into the common good to make our lives easier, to treat diseases and stuff like that. And they're all good. But there is the question of the absolute good of God, goodness of God. How do we reflect that as Christians in the skill sets and the tools that we have? And scientifically, ethicists and scientists look at, what is morality? Did we derive morality? And so it becomes very much of a theological and ethical question of, how do we define that? And scientists have looked at it. Do animals have morality? Do they have a sense of trust and a calling? But I think in terms of going forward, it's recognizing that we have these limitations, I think, is the first step. That humans will bring to bear on the tools that we create our own biases, and recognizing that we will bring that to whatever we create and looking out for that and bringing people to the table to discuss that. That's the first step. And I think I think scientists have started to realize that is you need multiple. I mean, one of the things I shared is you need multiple voices at the table, not just one group of people.
Yes, that's where we need theologians, we need ethicists, we need those who are committed to common good,
Mhm.
right? So, thank you for coming back to that and addressing that again, because I think we stimulated a lot of curiosity around it. I was sharing with Dr. Kim that in Japan, there is actually a robot that is an expression of AI or artificial intelligence that is serving a congregation as their pastor. And you can go online and look this up, and it'll have pictures and an article. And so when somebody experiences a death, the AI motivated robot will come to the person's home and say, "I'm sorry for your loss. I'm sorry for your loss." Well, something is lost in that, right?
Mhm.
I mean,
You could
so
say the same thing about something is lost in our virtual space, right? Like if I were sitting, if we're having a salon-like conversation, if I was able to visit the church, that gives another level
right.
of conversation than what we thankfully have because of science and technology, but still there's something missing as opposed to person. Same thing, I
Right.
think.
Exactly. So we'll move off of AI, but I wanted to bring that up because I've received so many email on it. And I also want you to hear that when I read the article about the robot pastor in Japan, the person who wrote the article said that in his humble opinion, that at the root of this whole issue is empathy and human connection and how we long for that. And Dr. Kim, you referenced that. That's one of the reasons why science needs religion
Mhm.
and religion needs science, because as we explore this universe that God has given us, we need human connection. We need each other in this journey, right?
Mhm. Absolutely.
Okay, I got to get to questions because they're piling up here. Okay, Dr. Kim, in the last session, you said plants remember seasons. Where is this data physically stored in the plant? How do they recall the memory of what has been learned and retained without a central nervous system? You say data is stored as evidenced by an outcome like modification of structure. Are you saying that plants remember seasons in the same way it may be said that the modifications of my skin tissue from trauma in the form of a scar is a structural memory?
That's a great question. And I actually had to, plants are very interesting. They actually share a lot with us, more than we think they do. And what I studied was DNA structure, and plants have DNA structure, right? So they have DNA, so they also have DNA structure. And you got, I think the question already understood how to answer in that question already, which is yes. If you speak of it physiologically in the definition of memory, it's input, processing, and a different output, whatever that output is, right? And in the sense of plants, yeah, the output will be a structural change in how they grow or how they respond.
Mm-hmm.
Really quickly, just as a primer, plants, for example, in addition to remembering season to season, which is more broad, what I looked at also is if you were to injure one leaf on one side, would they respond differently on another leaf? And there's some evidence to suggest that plants, if you trigger something in one leaf, it triggers a whole system to respond. Like, for example, if a bug were to eat one side of the leaf, the whole plant will respond and remember and respond differently the next time the bug comes. It's kind of like this reactive kind of a system. And it's more interesting because plants in a forest or whatever, or when they're planted together, they communicate through the roots. And so they have these interconnectedness that we can't really experiment in humans as much, or it's different context. So their sense of memory is interconnected throughout the whole plant system in the plants planted in that surrounding. So plants are really quite interesting. But yes, in the accurate definition of a physiological memory, they do have memory.
So what about the central nervous system comment?
They don't have a central nervous system, but central nervous system is just at the heart of it is a cell type for us, right? It's the neurons and how neurons remember. Remember what I talked about was DNA structure affecting neurons. In plants, it's just that DNA structure affect plant cells and not neuronal cells. So they don't have a central nervous system. But again, as to do they receive an input or a trauma, let's say you cut a leaf or a bug eats the leaf and then they respond differently the next time. Yeah, there is some evidence that they respond. They also respond to music. They also respond to touch. Plants who are touched grow differently than plants who are not touched. So plants are really quite fascinating.
So you talk about the root system underneath. Is it true only for plants or other vegetation?
I'm very limited in the knowledge here. I think fungi are also really quite connected like that. And I don't know a lot. I don't know anything about fungi, but I would suspect that they have the same type of sensitivity because they are a very interconnected kind of organism.
Great. All right, let's go to the next question. Do you think AI will eventually gain consciousness? How should we view such beings if they come along? As Christians, should we love them as our neighbors?
I was in a room one time with a lot of computer scientists and some theologians, and I think very bad in the Catholic system, but somebody really high in the Catholic system. Apologies to but it was a small round table, and they went around the room and asked this question, which is, what would robots or AI reach, as they say, singularity or consciousness? And like everybody had a different answer. So this is just to tell you that whether or not robots or AI reaches some level of consciousness is a very big unknown. This related question to that is, what is consciousness? Is it just, the field of Turing tests? Like, how do you how do you really realize and measure if something has consciousness? That's a whole nother field. What to do if they do reach consciousness? Well, I think that's a theological question, right? Because if they reach that, do they have a soul? What is a soul and spirit? So that's a Pastor Jeff question. That's not my question.
Well, interestingly enough, Pope Francis was asked, he was flying back from one of the countries he visited. And as he typically does, he goes back into the cabin where the press is. Well, they asked this very question. And Pope Francis said, well, of course I would baptize them because if they have consciousness, they have a soul. What's your response, Dr. Kim?
I defer to the intelligence of Pope Francis and the wisdom.
It's hard to beat that.
Well, it's a very similar question to what happens if we find aliens, right? And theologians say, well, we only know about the story that God told us about Earth, right? So what happens if we find aliens? It's the same exact question. Do we baptize them? I mean, is it so far stretched to, I mean, you could go anywhere with this multiverse. It's the same question.
That's
right. I defer to the theologians.
You're a wise woman. Okay, here's another question. Do you think the development of our consciousness is actually the story of Adam eating the apple and thus gaining the knowledge of good and evil, played out over thousands or millions of years?
Pastor Jeff, you might have further thoughts on this, which is what actually happens at the eating of the fruit, right? The way that I view it, if I were pressed to say, is that I think there is some endowment that God has, because God, Genesis tells us God created, very specific about how he created Adam and Eve. And I like to think that there is some special endowment that God gave Adam and Eve that gave rise to the spirit and the consciousness of Adam and Eve that may be different than pre-human kinds of the past, if one were to accept that there are pre-human kinds before Adam and Eve. So that's the mile marker, I guess, I put where consciousness, awareness, that when God created Adam and Eve, that's where I would put the point on, not necessarily when I eat the fruit, because to me, theologically, and Pastor Jeff can correct here, is the eating of the fruit is a distinctly different theological action than it is the actual act of creation. So I'll stop there because I don't want to misspeak.
Well, we're going to get into that if we have time later. So thank you. We'll hold the thought for a moment. Okay, let's have another question here. Dr. Kim, in the last session you were sharing, neurons that fire together wire together. Do you think confirmation bias is the result of this strengthening of neural pathways in combination with the threat to ego via social ostracism from admission of being incorrect? Confirmation bias seems to be an impediment to learning. If that is true, and our learning is what causes neurons to wire together, would that mean that learning causes us to be able to learn progressively less as the quantity and strength of these neural pathways increase?
The latter part, I would agree. And I think that's the ongoing theme. I mean, there's a lot of, I mean, there's a lot of debate whether adults can, for example, create new neurons, right? Does new memory form new neurons? And I think that's been an ongoing thing. And if it doesn't, then that's one of the ongoing thought is that because we're limited by that, while there's plasticity in the neurons themselves and the brain tissue, we're limited by that, the health of the neurons, so to speak. That's why they say you keep up your health, because the healthier your neurons, your memory and your brain function continues. As to confirmation bias, I think the way that genetics works, you have to recognize is a lot of these studies are done by what they, genetic studies. So we have mice and we have animals everywhere, everything from worms. I mean, so learning and memory studied everything from worms to bees to fruit flies, to mice, I mean, every model system. And genetics, one of the fundamental things that genetics does is look for genes that are responsible for certain steps in the process, right? And if we are able to, and we're able to remove some of those genes in these models and recognize that portion of the process doesn't work. So confirmation bias would say that we only look for it because it's, we're seeing it because we look for it, but we could also, what genetics say, knock it out and then it's gone. So we know that that gene that we knocked out is responsible for that function. And so we're able to also modulate the function, put more of it, put less of it through genetics, and a lot of the genetic studies can be, that's the essence of genetic studies. And through that, we're able to confirm, yes, if we don't have this gene, it blocks this function, and that's why the neurons don't get stronger or not. And also thing is, when we say neurons get stronger, that's on a cellular level, like from cell to cell from neuron, but we have to go microscopically and look at all the genes responsible for making those connections stronger, right? And that's everything from neurotransmitter release to actual structural proteins, everything that goes into making it stronger. But we know from genetics because we can modulate those genetic functions.
So, Dr. Kim, just to be really practical for a moment, what's the best way to strengthen the neuron or the neurons?
Well, that's the key question, right? Like, how do we become smarter, so to speak?
But we know there are ways, right?
We know there are ways. There are some evidence in, I think, limited tissue culture where you grow neurons in tissues that you can chemically increase the strength of those connections or chemically increase the action, neurons electricity, so you can measure the action potential. So you can, and that's a measurement. These potentials are the measurements of how they respond, and you can make them stronger, and there's using chemicals. Now, whether that translates into a human being is a very difficult thing to test.
But beyond chemicals, how else can you strengthen the neurons?
Well, that I think that's what people want to know, right? It's like, besides, I think people say, yes, overall health matters, taking care of your health matters, and we know that feeds into having a healthier brain. What's really been big in the past couple of years has been I mentioned this in passing, which is the gut-brain axis, which is your gut biosystem, microbiome in your gut has a very huge impact on your brain health. But that, I will tell you, I've spent many years with, I comically sometimes say that I played many years of my life with dumb mice and tried to mate with smarter mice, or mate dumb mice with dumb mice, and you just get dumber mice. So there's really, it's an ongoing research. How do we make our brain healthier? Yeah.
So Dr. Kim, one of the things that I'll throw out, and then you quickly refute it if I'm going down the wrong path, okay? But Dr. Sanjay Gupta, who's on TV, wrote a book on the brain. And it's a lot on neuroplasticity and how the brain is adaptable and how it heals itself, etc. But the whole premise of the book is on brain health and how we can increase our brain health and be focused on brain health by giving the brain the foods that it likes. His contention is the brain loves blueberries. Now, correct me, am I going down the wrong path here?
I think highly of Dr. Gupta. I think he's fabulous and done a great job of bringing health and medicine to the general public. And I think that's where he comes from. I mean, you have to remember that at heart, I'm a cellular biologist, so I think in a very different scale term. But as they say with blueberries, I mean, things like there are foods that limit, as they say, the reactive oxygen in our bodies, which is bad for our health. And that in turn, if you eat healthy foods, then you have healthy body. But taking a larger picture, for example, I'm very open to the idea that if God created us, he created our bodies to function well. And I think if we are to responsibly take care of it, then I'm sure that, there are good health outcomes. Aside from like my epigenetics, health, poor choices, and, I think there's something to be said. We're very holistic creatures. And I think science, if anything, have shown that you can't study the brain in isolation, for sure, right? You can't study any part of the body in isolation. And science has shown that we're very interconnected, both physically, mentally, mental health, and everything. So it makes sense to me to take care of it in a holistic manner from what he says. But again, I'm a cellular biologist at heart, so I think at a very different scale.
Naturally. So Dr. Gupta says that one of the things you ought to do is like Sudoku or crossword puzzles or anything to just keep the brain functioning in a way that challenges it, in a way that stimulates it. So we got to move on, doctor. Okay. In the last discussion, you were talking about rats. It seemed like you were saying the rats pass on the gene expression based on the original rat pair's learned experience. Is that correct? How does the experience or expression get passed down?
So that's the premise of epigenetics. So we know from Mendelian genetics, which is the historical genetics that we all learn in grade school, for example, if you have a mutation, the mutation is passed down, or if you don't have a mutation, the mutation isn't passed down. The traditional idea of heritability in terms of the genes, and that's the DNA sequence itself. What I talked about with epigenetics is this idea that the DNA sequence is fine, but there are other elements in the cell that is able to turn off or turn on the genes. And that's what's called epigenetics, through these modulations. And in that rat example, which was, for those of you who missed it, which was the idea that rats trained to dislike a certain smell that they would normally like. So they dislike this fruity smell. And then their grand pups, so their grandchildren, so to speak, their pups who have never been exposed to the smell, turns out that they also do not like the smell. And if we look at the genes, those genes are turned off and on. The combination of genes are turned off and on the same way that their grandparents was, even though these grand pups never experienced the smell. So that are trained to dislike the smell. So in the sense, yes, the gene expression, at the big picture, the gene expression is carried forward, but the mechanism is the epigenetics. So it's not a sequence thing, but something happens. That's the big unknown. The mystery in epigenetics is how is that carried forward? And what I didn't go into is that in the gamete stage, the epigenetic markers are all theoretically erased. And it has to be to preserve, there's some health impacts, mechanisms that requires the epigenetic markers to be all erased within each gamete. So it is interesting, and this is the big unknown, is how is that markers inherited from generation to generation, such that the same genes are turned on and off when they've never had the exposure. And that's the big mystery of epigenetics currently.
So Dr. Kim, is it similar to how genetics work relative to diabetes or mental health issues where it skips generations? I mean, how do you explain that?
So that, again, humans are much more complex because a lot of our diseases are a combination of genes and multiple genes. I mean, there are certainly diseases that are like single mutations for sure. But a lot of our more complex, more prevalent are very much many multiple genes. But we're also a combination of our genes and the predisposition depending on our environment. And so whether or not it skips a generation, those are, I think, that could be a good example. So another good example is if you have twins, they're genetically identical. Their DNA sequence is identical. But if we put twins in two different circumstances, theoretically, we can't do this with twins because we can't do it with humans, but we can do it in mice. But if you were to put twins who are genetically identical, in different environments and look at their grandchildren, the thought currently is that epigenetic markers will continue to inherit and have different outcomes based on those experiences of those twins.
Mm-hmm.
And it's very similar to how we might see diseases show up in one person, but not show up in another relative, even though they have the same predisposition.
So just like we were talking about the brain as environment matters and what we put into the brain matters, same environment matters. It's not the only factor, but it's an important one, right?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, we got to move on. In what ways is a soul distinguishable from the physical mind and by extension, our emotions? So we're going to get into that one when I talk about Genesis. So we'll skip that one for now, Doctor.
Good, because I think you'll answer it better than I.
I don't know about that, but we'll try. According to some quantum theorists, on an extremely micro level, particles are in superposition and don't settle into a discrete state until observed. Some think, therefore, that consciousness actually creates the universe pretty far out. What do you think?
That's very what's that movie? It's like It's All in Our Mind kind of a thing. I hope not. That's where our faith comes in. I will say something about quantum, though. I'm not a physicist by any means. I do find it very fascinating that a lot of physicists who experience the science and religion dialogue very differently than biologists. One of the things that I always am very encouraged by what they say is that both faith and science are not new to the unseen.
Right.
Because physics and mathematics at the core of it are all based on a set of principles and theorems and calculations that of things that realities that we can't see, like quarks and all the other things that you've mentioned. And belief is very much the same way. And yet we are able to extrapolate in science and mathematics and physics based on the outcome and the circumstances and the experiment surrounding it, right? We know the properties around it, therefore we can make XYZ conclusions. Yes, Matrix was the movie that I was thinking of. So it is, I find it very profound when physicists and mathematics say that both faith and science are are not immune. Well, not a stranger to the unseen.
Right.
And there is some element of faith in both.
So one of the things that I wanted to try on for size as we transition to the theological focus for a moment on this topic is that my understanding, and I'm asking you, Dr. Kim, as the expert scientist here, my understanding of quantum physics is that the more we know we don't know kind of element, that there is room for mystery in quantum physics. And quantum physics depends upon that element of mystery. Now, please respond to that from a scientist's perspective.
I'm a biologist. I'll respond as a biologist. I've heard that, and I think it is true. There's a running joke among scientists that there's a tier of science, at the end of the day, like biologists depend on biochemistry, which is chemistry, which is physics, and then which is mathematics. And so that just tells you that in some ways, it goes back to what I said before. In some ways, I'm left to be profound thoughts of those colleagues who are in physics and mathematics, because I think they're able to ask those questions that biologist is in a different field and level, that not level as in like, not saying all biologists are different, but I'm saying our scale of measurements are different. And so we can't ask the same questions.
So Dr. Spitzer, who's a PhD physicist, says that quantum physics is dependent on the element of mystery. And the Greek word for mystery is speechless.
Wow, I didn't know that.
Yes. So when you hear the word mystery in Greek, it means unable to speak, unable to explain, unable to really extrapolate. And so nature in its origin implies awe, wonder, that sense of I can experience it, but I cannot explain it.
Mhm.
It's like the color green. How do you explain the color green?
Well, I think an analogous question to biologists is how do we explain love? How do
Right,
we, is it a biochemical reaction, or is it, we can measure it in terms of, yeah, dilation and of eyes and,
right.
heartbeat and things like that. But what is it really? I
Mhm.
think that biological response, yes, we can measure, but the true definition, we really can't. But there is I think believers or not, scientists of all fields, and biologists included, would say that the mystery of discovery and curiosity is what is one of the things that got them into science, right? For
Mhm.
sure. And the all of mystery, the all of trying to, and that, eureka moment that they're the first one to think about this, or they're the first ones to see something. I think every scientist has that story. And that shapes, the scientist's experience. So I don't think but at the same time, those kind of feeling is unique because it's also God-given. We marvel at the wonder, as David did in the Psalms.
Yes. Well, that leads me into this. And Dr. Kim, I want you to respond as I'm sharing, please. Okay. And then, folks, if you have questions about this, don't hesitate to ask. So, the book of Genesis in particular, well, let me back up a second. The first thing we need to realize when we look at the book of Genesis is that the word Bible in Greek actually means collection of books. So the Bible is a collection of books, which implies a variety of genre. So, in my humble opinion, and there are many who go down this path as well. This is not just Jeff's idea here. It's informed by scholarship that the book of Genesis is one of the most complicated of biblical books because it represents a variety of genre, whereas many of the Bible books have a particular genre that is true throughout the whole book. That's not true of the book of Genesis. So there's a variety of genre that is being utilized in order to talk about God as creator, focusing on the why of creation, not the how. So I want to show you something. And let me see if I can bring this up here. Well, there we go. I do this with the confirmation class because it's a way for us to explore the different genre of the book of Revelation or book of Genesis. And I also do this with Revelation as well. But when you look at the book of Genesis, I want you to see this, that there are two creation stories in the book of Genesis. There are not, there is not one, there are two, and that's very purposeful. Now, I want to say something because this is a very long topic that I have to be very succinct with, but it's important for you to hear. I believe the Bible is inspired, but I don't have a need to believe that the Bible is infallible. There's a critical difference. I think the Bible is inspired. It gives us everything that we need to know about God and humanity and how to be saved, how to experience the good news. But apart from that, there's a lot of genre that is inviting us to focus on God and his relationship with people and our relationship with each other. So I take the confirmation class, and these are students, and they love this because it gets out of Genesis as a science book of 6 literal days, or if you believe in a young earth of 6,000 years. All of those questions are largely irrelevant when it comes to the focus on why God created rather than how. Because in Genesis 1 and 2, and have you heard this before, Dr. Kim? Genesis 1 and 2 are two different creation stories, all within the same book, different genre. So who created the heaven and the earth? Did God have help, or did he do it alone? And we won't take time to walk through this, but guess what? All of these 10 questions, when I have the youth do this, I split them into 2 groups and I say, you're the Genesis 1 group, you're the Genesis 2 group. And the fascinating thing is, as they walk through this, it first poses what on the surface looks like a contradiction. And sometimes people say, well, see, that's why I don't believe the Bible. That's why I throw the Bible out. I say, oh, no, that's not, that you can do that, but that would not be helpful, nor is it being true to the book of Genesis and God's intended purpose. So when you look at these 10 questions, you will see that you have 2 distinct stories with 2 different descriptions of how God made the earth. Now, what's the point of that? The point of that is to say the focus is not on how. The focus is on why. Why did God create the heavens and the earth? What's the point? So when I take you through this exercise, invariably people will say, okay, Pastor, what you're really saying is that God is the creator. And if God is the creator, then God focuses on why God made us, and therefore all other things go to the way, to the sideway, to the roadway, to the what am I trying to say? To the edge. They are not the most important part about these stories. So let me stop talking and get Dr. Kim's response to this.
I want to be in that class. It sounds like a fun class. I think there's probably 3 major groups of people, right? First is we have believers who believe in the literal, word for word.
Right.
And then we have people who try to kind of interpret it in a sciencey way, saying, could the days be longer? And then we have the third, which is more literary, not literal, but in, what did the ancient Near Eastern writers actually think when they wrote this? And it goes back to, well, they wrote it because they wanted to answer the why question and the purpose question. I think that's
Right.
what you're trying to get at. I certainly think we all have wrecked our brain. I know I have wrecked my brain trying to fit in Genesis 2:4 into the 6th day in Genesis 1, and then find all these discrepancies. And so we're left with these questions. But I think the one thing that's really helped me is recognizing that why question, and to realize that this was God's word written to ancient Near East people who did not have the accessibility to the science or our interpretation of science that we have today, right?
Right.
And so keeping that in mind of why the book was written the way it was written in those times, I thought has always helped me read it in context.
That's a really good point, Dr. Kim. See, I should have just had you present on it, because you're explaining it much better than I. But so here's the reason why there are 2 stories. Not to create a challenge or to create conflict or to create inconsistency. That's not the point. So Dr. Kim said something important about what was happening contextually, which we may get to, but I'm going to put that on the back burner for now. what I then take the confirmation class through is an exercise of, once they answer these questions, then I show that the whole point of Genesis 1 and 2 is to say two important things about God. First, that God is transcendent, that God is big and beyond, and God is immanent, that God is close and near. And we need both. Unfortunately, in church history, we have movements that emphasize the transcendence, and we have movements that emphasize the immanence. And we need both. God is greater than humanity, and yet God is with us. And if you look at Genesis 1 and 2, that's the whole point. It's a statement about God being great. Psalm 8, when I look at the heavens that you have made, the heavens is plural because it's talking about the universe. When I look at all that you have made, I stand in awe and wonder. How excellent is your name, right? That sense of majesty and awe. And yet Genesis 2 is all about the God who gets on his knees and is right there with Adam, breathing life into him. It's very intimate. In fact, that idea of mouth-to-mouth resuscitation, if you will, is a description of God's intimacy and God's closeness. So it's first a statement about God as transcendent, beyond, and big, and immanent, as close and near. But then it's a statement, this brings in the whole contextual component, where it's also a statement about humanity. So in Genesis 1, humanity is created at the apex of creation, the last before the Sabbath, which is a biblical way of saying saving the best for last. So as Dr. Kim said, contextually, human beings were considered low. Human beings were considered scum, that human beings had no value contextually. And yet Genesis is a response to that, saying, no, we are a little lower than the angels. That's Psalm 8. When I think of all that God has made, what is man that thou art mindful of him? The son of man that thou dost care for him, which is the King James Version way of saying, you look at the God who made all that is, yet God knows us and God loves us. And God knows you, Dr. Kim, by name, intimacy, yet God is able to do exceedingly abundantly greater things. So when you look at the book of Genesis from this perspective, whenever I have somebody come up to me and say, well, Pastor, I insist that God used 6 literal days, I have no need to say, well, that's not right. What I do is to take them on a journey of saying, let's get beyond putting God in a box, because if you believe that God is the creator, God can use an evolutionary process or whatever God desires to use in order to reveal.
I think we lost sound for Pastor Jeff.
How's that?
Oh, you're back.
See, I'm not caught up into the 6 literal days or whether it's a day represents 1,000,000 years or whatever. To me, that is not the point of the book of Genesis. Now, Dr. Kim, how would you respond to that before I move on to one other thing?
I don't know if there's an actual question. I think, well, I agree with what you're saying. I think to, church family members who think differently than we do, just always remembering that they are in a journey, and that whatever position anyone takes, there's always still going to be questions.
That's right.
So even if we take a solid position, whether it's literal or not literal and figurative interpretation, whatever the choice that you may pick, it's still going to raise the same questions of meaning and purpose, and to give room for that discovery and not just the science point of it.
Yes. So, Dr. Kim, see, the thing that I say to these young people, and they just soak this up like sponges. This idea that kids are bored and that they're not interested in learning, I do not buy into that. When we have this conversation, I don't have to pull out tricks and gimmicks in order to keep them connected. This topic is of interest because of where we put the focus. And it sets them free so that then if they have the person who wants to cram a particular theory down their throat, they can respond with freedom. I know that I am created in the image and likeness of God. See, that's one of the things contextually that the writer of Genesis is trying to come against, that humanity's the scum of the earth. No, we're created in the image and likeness of God. And even though Genesis 3 talks about the reality of sin, we never lose the image, but we always grow in the likeness. We never lose the image, but we grow in the likeness. So every human being is a person of sacred worth. Every human being is extraordinarily valuable, however you choose to say that. And that's one of the points of the book of Genesis. It's all about the why. Why did God create humanity? Because we reflect God. We're created in his image and likeness, and we, though sinful, though broken, we can still grow in his likeness. So
I love
I'm
what you
sounding
say
kind
there
of
because
preachy.
I just want to insert that I love what you say there because you said, you know, the value of human life and the sanctity. And I think that is the key crux of what we want to instill when questions of genetic engineering and AI come forward.
That's
in
right.
these emerging technologies. So
That's right.
I love the way you say it. So
thank you. You're very kind. So one of the things that Dr. Kim and I want to do is to provide some resources for you on these topics, because I have here a man from Baylor University, William Lane Craig, professor of philosophy, and he has written a book titled In Quest of the Historical Atom, a Biblical and Scientific Exploration. Have you read that book, Dr. Kim? You're mummed now. Your son.
I think he has a new book out. That he has a new book coming out, I think, has come out in September. So yes.
Yeah, this comes from the October edition of Christianity Today. So I don't know, maybe there's something more recent.
He does, it's probably referring to a September book he released in September, because I had it on my Amazon inbox.
Okay, great. Well, I'm fascinated because he is a person who shares the viewpoint that I've shared tonight. That it gets into genre and the why, the focus is on the why, and therefore be careful what you do with the book of Genesis. So one other thing, Dr. Kim, that I wanted to talk about, our time is running out quickly. It's amazing to me how the time just flies. But I mentioned to you, Dr. Kim, that my interest in Noam Chomsky's book, Why Only Us? And that gets into the whole idea of the soul, in my opinion. And if you haven't read the book, Noam Chomsky, it's a unique name. He's a linguist. He's very famous in the scientific realm because he's done a lot of experiments on chimpanzees and the like relative to language. And he is one, along with another person from MIT, who's been writing about a significant event that happened 70,000 years ago. And I asked Dr. Kim if she wanted to comment on this, and you may or may not want to, because I know this is outside of your realm of expertise. But this whole idea that something significant happened 70,000 years ago, which even for Noam Chomsky, who is a self-avowed practicing atheist, he says something happened and he chalks it up to mystery. As a person of faith, I chalk it up to God did something distinct 70,000 years ago. Do you care to respond, Dr. Kim?
My understanding of the something this serious happening is he's referring to the creativity and the creation of language. So it is very, to me, you're right. I agree that it's very related to our sense of consciousness, because how else can we talk about God if you and I cannot converse and equally understand what each others are saying? How can we converse about our soul and our spirit and about God and creation? And I think he's referring to that creativity of recognition and forming these conceptual ideas that is currently inexplicable. I think it's really great, and those are the moments when we recognize that there's awe and wonder in the science as much as we study it. I always put a caution saying we may not understand it now, but don't hang our hat of faith on the understanding of it.
Right.
We should definitely, I think, reflect on the wonder of it, but don't hang our hat on faith on that aspect. But I do think that question for me, as somebody who studied the brain, I think language is interesting, because that question of what is that mysterious thing is this, to me, means when did consciousness happen? We talked about this a little bit at the beginning, is what then is consciousness? Because obviously language is consciousness coming to fruition, so we can talk about what is consciousness. So what is that? So that's how I see it too. But.
So one other thing, Dr. Kim, is our time is almost out, but I have to ask you this, because I'm fascinated by this work of Noam Chomsky, because in addition to what you shared, Dr. Kim, the thing that fascinates me most is language is fascinating, and something definitely happened because, and I want to go off on this tangent for just a moment, and then I'll come back to my main point. And that is that when the chimpanzee that was named after Noam Chomsky, who knows how many different sign language, I forget, the brain of the chimp is amazing, but the chimp was unable to distinguish between man bites dog and dog bites man.
I didn't know the specific distinction, but.
So that 70,000 years ago, according to Noam Chomsky, something happened to where we as human beings can distinguish between dog bites man, man bites dog. And when you even say to a child, man bites dog, they laugh. They know that that's ludicrous, right?
Well, I mean, there's some fascinating studies in children about how they perceive the world. Even, I think the word is teleologically, they perceive the why in things,
right?
Not necessarily the how in things.
Yeah.
And so there's some really amazing research in the cognitive neuroscience of religion, which I encourage folks to read if they're interested in, what makes humans unique in that aspect.
Right.
But animals, yes, it's hard to tell. It's a very AI question too. Are they learning repetition, and are they just learning responses back and forth, or are they actually comprehending language?
Yeah. So Chomsky says in his book that the chimp does not have the capacity to distinguish between man bites dog and dog bites man. So in his opinion, now remember, he's a self-avowed practicing atheist. He says there is something unique about the human person. Because, and this is a part, Dr. Kim, that I wanted to share and then get your response. In addition to the beauty of language, then all of a sudden we have the arts. Prior to 70,000 years ago, we did not have art. We did not have creativity. We did not have language. And Noam Chomsky says that 70,000 years ago, humans began burying the dead. And we didn't do that before. We did it with honor and respect. What's that about, Dr. Kim?
Well, I'm in DC, and they have a really great exhibit at the Natural History Museum where they asked this precise question, but the burying of the dead is very interesting too. But what happened at that time point is also is related to, does that make them human, or does that make them that kind? Does that make them a humankind, or does that make them some sort of a pre-consciousness that was a little bit more developed than what we recognize as humans? And so it's back to again, what makes us human question. But yes, it is remarkable that there are certain questions lingering about religion, the rise of religion, or the idea that there's something after death, or respecting the dead, and the idea of religion. But that boundary seems very up for debate and conversation.
That's right. And that's why Noam Chomsky says, again, as a self-avowed practicing atheist, he says, this causes me to wonder about the soul. And what happened that all of a sudden we become more than we ever were before? In our ancestors, whatever those ancestors were. I mean, we can talk about different types, right? But without getting into that, whatever that pre-human was, or even if they were human, there's something distinct about this event 70,000 years ago.
I think there's language is one, but I think it's fascinating. There's lots of examples like that, like sense of building of cities and communities.
That's right.
Is another one.
Right. They actually moved. They migrated.
So there are archaeological incidences like that seemed inexplicable, or triggers the question or begs the question, what happened all of a sudden?
Yes. So I'm belaboring the point, but because I have a real particular interest in this, and sometime I want to have Dr. Kim back, and I want to talk about the soul as a near-death experience from a scientific perspective. I want to pick your brain on that sometime.
Well, I'm always happy for these kind of conversations, but I also know that there's tons of other experts who are well versed in that topic. So
that's your humility speaking again. Okay, one final question, Dr. Kim. Will you allow one more question, please?
Yes.
I haven't looked up the AAAS Dr. Kim was mentioning last time, but she was saying she wants to foster the discussion between science and religion. I wonder if she would be interested in a discussion with the popular YouTubers I follow that are atheist science folks. I know of lots of kind folks that could have a much more intelligent discussion than I could have. I think we may have an opportunity to bring people together in constructive ways if you're interested.
Well, thank you for that kind invitation. I'm always happy to have further conversation. I will just plug and say that there's lots of great opportunities, not just myself, but others as well. I didn't get to share a resource slide, but I'll pass that along to Pastor Jeff so he can share. But there are lots of great Christian-based organizations who are interested in science and faith dialogue. AAAS is not a Christian organization, they're a science organization, but there are also a lot of people like myself, and even better than myself, much better than myself. So I'm happy to participate. Happy to be connected, and we'll talk further.
Dr. Kim, thank you. You are a blessing to us and to this world.
Thank you. I really champion what you're trying to do and what you are doing in the church. I think it is very important, and I commend you, Pastor Jeff, and
thank you,
the church family who's made the time this evening to join us.
Yes, and also this recording will be available on YouTube, and we're finding that many people are going to YouTube and listening again and again because people want to absorb it. So without further ado, I want to say again, our deepest gratitude to you, Dr. Kim, And also to you that have been participating, as Dr. Kim said a few minutes ago. We could not do this without the support of our congregation, without the support of the Kansas Area United Methodist Foundation and their willingness to provide some of the expense for technology. And again, thank you for your interest in these topics, because we learn and grow together when we create the safe places to ask the hard questions. So have a wonderful night, everybody. Good night and God bless. Thanks again, Dr. Kim.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye now.